Good afternoon. Welcome to the season 2 finale of Remaking the Economy. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of the Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, and I'm here with 3 of our advisory committee members, Elizabeth Castillo, Will Cordery, and Camille Kerr, to discuss system change, COVID, nonprofits, and the economy. A whole lot can be said about this topic and the times we face. We view this discussion as just one small piece of that. At the end of the webinar, there's a survey where we ask for your suggestions about future topics, so please fill that out. For today's discussion, we have 3 panelists. Elizabeth Castillo teaches leadership at Arizona State University. Will Cordery is based in New York City and is an advisor with Leveraged Philanthropic Partners and has worked with Black worker centers across the US. Camille Kerr is a worker ownership expert and founder of Upside Down Consulting in Chicago. A few notes before we get started. First, we're really excited to take your questions. In fact, we've kept slides at a minimum to maximize the time you have for your questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen, and I will share them with panelists. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing these webinars obviously is not. So if you like what we are doing and are able to support NPQ's economic justice work, please consider making a donation today. And speaking of donations, I wanted to thank on air Fund for Democratic Communities, which just recently made a donation before they spent out their foundation to NPQ. You can also join the conversation via social media with our hashtag, Rebuild the Economy. Share your comments and questions. We'd love to hear them and continue the conversation. Thanks for joining us. And again, look for that survey after the webinar. And with that, I wanted to start with a question for Will Cordery. And Will, you've worked a lot with Black worker centers, and obviously Black workers are hugely impacted by COVID-19. Can you talk about that impact and what those centers are calling for?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, thank you. I want to thank NPQ for including me in this important conversation. As Steve said, my name is Will Cordery, and I'm an advisor with Leveraged Philanthropic Partners. Leverage is a social impact firm working to advance justice by providing capacity building to foundations, nonprofits, and high net worth individuals. And I have spent over the past 17 years as a community organizer, a fundraiser, and a grant maker working to advance both racial justice and economic justice. So while this pandemic has appended what billions of people thought was safe and secure infrastructure, it has actually just further illuminated the structural racism in this country and this country's systems of healthcare and economic and environmental systems. And in particular, COVID-19 has had and will continue to have a devastating impact and racialized impact on Black communities in this country, both in terms of health and economic security. So when it comes to the nature of work across this country, most essential workers, as we now know, if you didn't know before, are Black and brown people, and particularly Black and brown women. They are Black and brown people who are providing for their families. Most Black workers are essential workers. And as we know now, essential work includes grocery, food delivery, transit, retail, healthcare, childcare, domestic work, to name a few. I actually wanted to lift up a couple of places where Black workers have been organizing to respond to the crisis with mutual aid and some policy demands. So in Los Angeles, there is a worker center, the LA Black Worker Center. They set up a phone tree pretty soon after quarantine happened in mid-March. And this was to keep lines of communication open, primarily because they knew job loss would soon begin for their constituents and that those phones would soon be getting turned off. They've also provided some mutual aid work to their members. This includes grocery delivery for folks who cannot get out, who no longer have access to transit. And they've also partnered with the St. John's Health Clinics in Los Angeles to provide mobile testing sites for Black communities and Black workers. Now, this has not been without some challenges. Some of those mobile sites are now seeing the visibility of police. which is then creating intimidation for Black workers and undocumented folks who come to get tested for COVID-19. Another place where there's a worker center, a Black worker center, is New Orleans. And we are just hearing in the last few days that last week, all of the sanitation workers were fired after going on strike due to unsafe work conditions and low pay. If that weren't bad enough, they were being replaced or have been replaced by prison labor. The prison labor is making about $1.33 an hour, 13% of what the sanitation workers were making, which was already low pay. And all of those sanitation workers were Black men. And then lastly, in Chicago, members of the Worker Center for Racial Justice has been developing or has been hand delivering personal protection equipment to their members that must continue to work. For many of them, their employers have not been providing PPE. I think it's important to note that in Chicago, 70% of the COVID cases in April were among Black folks, while Black folks only make up 20% of the city's population. And frontline workers obviously have been hit the hardest. And as of the end of April, 7.5 million folks in the state of Illinois were unemployed. So as COVID-19 has had these, and will continue to have long-term impact on the US economy and jobs, Black and brown folks and workers in particular have begun developing a list of demands. And in Illinois, the Worker Center for Racial Justice has developed a COVID-19 racial agenda. These demands, they run the full span of kind of economic justice demands, workers' rights, criminal justice reform, and equitable democracy. I just wanted to lift up a few that they have shared related to workers in particular. And so some of these demands include: one, ensure adequate protections to all essential workers on the front lines of the pandemic. Two, invest in emergency and long-term financial assistance to low-income, middle-income households. Three, restore the basic needs of the safety net for Illinois' most vulnerable households. And then now you can switch to the next slide. Four, expand eligibility and funding to the child care assistance program in Illinois. Five, direct small business relief to Black-owned businesses. I think everyone's been watching the news and seeing just how the federal stimulus funding has been, quote unquote, trickling down, but not trickling beyond multi-million-dollar organizations or corporations. So they're asking for an intentional investment in Black-owned businesses. And then finally, increase state revenue through progressive taxation. So this is, like I said, part of a larger sweeping agenda that the Worker Center in Chicago has developed. And although it was developed with Black workers in mind for the state of Illinois, this can obviously be adapted for other communities in struggle right now. There is one additional kind of list of recommendations that have been coming out of spaces where Black folks have been working. And if you could shift to the next slide. Yeah, so just a monthly stimulus check. The economic pandemic is going to last for quite some time. An increase in the earned income tax credit, efforts to stabilize housing. There are other cities that are now looking at rent stabilization as a model similar to what we have here in New York City. We can have a different conversation about how well that works. Another demand is canceling rents and mortgages during the crisis. And in fact, since trillions and trillions of dollars are coming out of federal stimulus funding, those funds can be allocated to offset those cancellations and go directly to those companies if that is an issue. And then finally, property tax relief, but also legal representation provided in eviction courts. This is similar to the model of public defenders in criminal courts, but having free legal counsel for folks that are dealing with eviction at this time. So I'll stop there and let us pick up any questions folks may have later on.
Thanks, Will. Next up, Camille, you've been working a lot with worker cooperatives for a number of years. How is the worker cooperative movement responding to the COVID-19 emergency?
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. And like Will, I want to thank MPQ for inviting me and hosting me in this critical conversation at this moment. As we all know, our economic system, this is just elevating the unfairness of our economic system. This is not, these inequities are not new. Our system is built to put property rights above human health and well-being. It was successfully designed to benefit the wealthy and to harm people of color. And the changes that we need, this is a systems change webinar, the changes that we need require radical policy changes to the fundamental elements of what makes up our economic system. But doing that kind of change requires a lot of foundation building. It requires changing the narrative about what's possible. A lot of folks only think this is the only system that is possible. It requires building power in order to make those policy changes, political power that can move us there. It requires building the skills to operate in a different kind of system. Right now, we often don't have the skills to cooperate as well as we should, the skills to respect each other in the way that we need to have a different type of system. And it requires us demonstrating some new models. And I think these all feed into each other, right? If we demonstrate what a new model for how our economy could look like, that can change the narrative. And if we change the narrative, we have a better time building power, et cetera. So these are all can feed into each other in a virtuous cycle. So one of the work that I'm putting my energy into, like Steve said, I've been in the worker cooperative field for about a decade now. The work that I'm putting my energy into is building one of those new models that I hope can change the narrative, that I hope can build power and skills for the next economic system. And so I've been putting a lot of work and energy into an organization called Shy Fresh Kitchen. We are a worker cooperative owned and controlled by formerly incarcerated women, primarily Black women on the south and west sides of Chicago. It's democratically controlled. They own the equipment. They own everything. They make the decisions. They tell me what to do. This is a business. They're collectively owned and governed. This is a business that is owned by these women. And if you find them on Facebook, you can see their Facebook live feeds. They very squarely own this business, and I provide a support system to them in terms of the barriers that capitalism puts up for people to own their own businesses. But that's all I'm doing is I'm dealing with the paperwork and the compliance, but they are making the food, delivering the food, deciding what food to create and send. And we weren't going to launch until June. But our workers are retail workers, they're restaurant workers, and they were laid off. Many of them were laid off, and many of them couldn't access the unemployment system for one reason or another, just timing or the nature of their previous work or whatever it was, they couldn't access. So they were like, can we get this thing started earlier? And I'm like, all right, let's launch a business in the middle of a pandemic, but we're doing it, right? We started creating, sending out meals last Monday. This is our second week of food. We started with 50 meals a day, and now next week we'll be doing 150 meals a day. We're providing them to folks in our own communities who are experiencing food insecurity. So we're giving them to transitional homes, to nonprofits that provide services to nursing homes. And we're not building it alone. We're building it we're sourcing from urban farms. We're partnering with fellow worker cooperatives to get these meals out the door. And we are hoping that our model can demonstrate that we can meet our own needs and set the stage for what a new economic system that centers people over profits, but over property, over, that centers people and our planet. What we're doing, albeit small right now with 5 worker owners, can help change that narrative and help build power towards the next system. And I'll stop there for now, Steve. Oh, I'm going to say one more thing. We just got highlighted in Next City. I don't know if folks are familiar with Oscar Abello, who just got an award for his incredible work lifting up the work of folks on the ground. And so we'd love for you all to read about us there too. Go ahead, Steve.
Great, thanks so much. Elizabeth, could you talk a little bit, we know that the economic model that we've had before the pandemic is flawed in so many ways. Could you talk about what an alternative framework would look like and how to actually think about applying some of those principles to the current crisis?
Yes, thank you so much, Steve. And thank you to everyone for participating today. We really appreciate you investing time and becoming part of this conversation. The work that I've been doing is focusing on social accounting with the idea that if we're going to create an economy that works for everyone, we've got to begin accounting for our values. And we can do this by expanding our thinking about what counts as a resource. Whereas economics conventionally focuses on financial capital, there's growing recognition that intangible assets like relationships, knowledge, and reputation are also fundamental drivers of sustainable prosperity. The well-being of people and nature are also essential. Yet our current management and accounting practices tend to look at these as cost centers rather than investments. And this leads to underinvestment in things like staffing, professional development, and taking time to listen and nurture quality relationships with different stakeholders. So social accounting offers an escape from this selective attention on financial capital. Like conventional accounting, it focuses on capital, which it broadly defines as resources that endure and can generate more resources. But social accounting recognizes both tangible and intangible resources, such as human, natural, social, symbolic, and structural capitals. And what this does gives us a wider lens that provides a systematic framework to account for things like values, creativity, power, governance, and accountability. And it also enables us to see things as a whole and how these values manifest across different levels, and whether we create value for society or extract value from society. The spider diagram on the right from WealthWorks is an example of how metrics can be used and developed for each type of capital. And then you can see systematically how they come together to create value synergistically. In social accounting models such as integrated reporting, while their commonality is that they account for resources holistically. They inclusively include stakeholder perspectives rather than just investors. And they show the relationships between multiple levels, such as individuals, organizations, communities, and societies. And this promotes integrated thinking, the ability to see connections and interdependencies, which gives us more options for systematic approach to analysis, management, and public policy. Next slide, please. And for a quick example of what this looks like in practice, I wanted to take a look at a recent article that came out in Nonprofit Quarterly on nursing home failures in relation to the COVID-19 deaths. So Karen Kahn wrote this and did an insightful examination of what looks like on the surface a problem that appears to be demographic, since elders are more likely to be affected by coronavirus. But her deeper dive points out really the structural issues that led to a systemic failure like this. For example, over the past 10 years, there's been a change in ownership models, whereas once nursing homes were operated as small, independent, mission-driven nonprofits and family-owned operations that really focused on providing quality care for our elders. Today, over 70% of nursing homes are operated by for-profits, and this has shifted the focus from quality and care to cost containment, which has in turn led to lower staffing levels, poor infection control, and less regulatory oversight and accountability. Systemically, the result has been inequitable impacts on frontline workers and higher mortality rates for elders than needs to have happened. A multiple capitals perspective enables us to identify the various aspects of such complex situations to see how they're related. It also points to potential remedies, such as the need for the nonprofit sector to become more active in policy making, and as Nonprofit Quarterly editors have been discussing recently. Next slide, please. Perhaps more importantly, social accounting enables us to reintegrate our values into our economic thinking. In particular, integrated reporting's inclusive stakeholder orientation improves decision-making through increased transparency and attention to shared orientation and governance principles. It makes explicit what we value, the processes we use to govern our organizations and systems, and to recognize and remedy power imbalances. It asks questions like, what is important and how can it be counted? Whose values and perspectives count? And what are the key values that orient our decisions and actions? This enables integrative thinking to recognize the importance of context, pluralism, trade-offs, and impacts across scales. Rather than trying to reduce complexity, which leads to marginalization of less powerful stakeholders, social accounting focuses on developing capabilities and power across different scales to contribute to society well-being and the common good. So that's it.
Okay, and so we'll have a more free-form discussion. Thanks, Elizabeth, so much. And I thought I'd ask a question to all of you as a group about, this moment we're in. How should we think about it? And what do you see as I don't know if it's a collective vision or collective visions that are emerging? And whoever wants to jump in first. Don't be shy.
Well, I'll say, so for me, I think what the pandemic is showing us is the need to recognize individual and collective actions. We've let ourselves become polarized by failing to see our interconnections. And the pandemic has brought into very clear focus, both through physical contagion and the devastating economic and mental impacts of social distancing. It's making clear how dependent we actually are on each other and how we need cooperative action to produce the common good. It's also brought into focus how we need to increase self-sufficiency of people so our well-being is not tied solely to our work-provided benefits. And my hope is that we can use this crisis as an opportunity to reimagine what kind of society we want to create rather than trying to incrementally patch up dysfunctions. Great, thanks.
Will or Camille?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to this earlier, but hundreds of millions of people who never thought they would be impacted by housing insecurity, by job insecurity, by economic insecurity, are now feeling it for the first time in their lives. They always thought it was something that was so far marginal that they would read about it, but never personally experience it. I think the numbers now are 2.4, 2.5 million people are applying for unemployment every week. There is a huge opportunity here to bring people into the fold, millions and millions of people into the fold, to have a different conversation, to reimagine something that works for everyone, and quite frankly, to organize. I'm on here kind of speaking the gospel for Black workers, but what we're really talking about here is the right of workers. And so many folks who didn't put themselves into that category or naming ourselves as workers are frankly that. And so there's just a huge opportunity here to organize, bring people in movement spaces. We consider this political education, when you have these kind of like real personal experiences, historical experiences, kind of socio-political experiences that shape your politics and your beliefs, your values. And that's frankly what I feel we're in now. And so, yeah, I just think there's a huge opportunity to organize if we as people are open to it, and if philanthropy, if movements resource themselves to be able to do that type of work.
Great, thanks. And I really like the point about workers. Camille, anything you want to jump in on?
So I was just going to add to what Will had to say by adding that we have this opportunity to build a movement. We also have an opportunity to build structures, build the infrastructure for a new economic system. So we want to change that narrative, build political power, and we want to demonstrate that these ideas that we've been talking about can come to life. But that's all I wanted to add, because I think Will captured really what we can do in this moment well.
Great. And Will, just following up on that last point, could you talk a little bit about what you see as the impact of the pandemic on the economy and the world of work?
Well, I think the nature of work is changing so quickly, and these are conversations that have been happening for quite some time, right? Around what work looks like and how we value work. So yeah, the nature of work is changing very quickly in terms of what work is considered valued, in terms of what jobs are protected, in terms of what types of economies will be scaled and which ones will not. It's further illuminating the value of essential work that had such a negative connotation to it prior to COVID-19 is absolutely critical to survival for everyone. And so there's an opportunity here to really fund workers in the way that we should. I know there's lots of different policies moving, including proposals for hazard pay or hero pay, which can increase hourly wages from anywhere from $2 to $10 an hour. That's great. And that's what pay should have been at minimum, a long time ago. And so, yeah, there's just, there's a lot yet to kind of be reimagined and learned. And Steve, help me, was there another piece to your question?
Well, I was just, it's, sort of how do you, how is this, the question was simply about the pandemic and how it affects the economy and workers.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's still yet to be seen. Like, so many things are being rewritten. Structures that we have known are being rewritten, and we're all trying to figure it out in real time. I do think that similar to the economic agenda that I shared at the top of this call, there is an opportunity to push for bolder demands, and similar to what Camille shared as well. Like, let's be bold and out there in terms of creating something new and different. And the pandemic has given us that opportunity to do so. And, we are in this kind of virtual or kind of quiet war of capitalism as we've known it and something else, right? And the something else that this country may not want to embrace as socialism, but frankly, millions upon millions of people are learning every day that capitalism as we know it isn't working. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Camille, I wanted to ask about how do we build up infrastructure for a different system, and so we can create something where workers can rely on themselves to meet their own needs?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can hear me, right? So what kind of started happening in Chicago right away after this pandemic is some North Side white-led organizations that were larger got significant amounts of funding to provide food to people on the South and West Sides. And some of us were like, well, wait a minute, because we know how to make food. If you're going to give people money to, if you're going to give them all the groceries and give them money to make food for a lot of people, there's nothing in our communities that's stopping us from making our own food. Like the only, if you're going to provide funding to feed people, let's provide resources to create the infrastructure so that our communities can meet their own needs, right? And so that's part of what we're doing here in Chicago is we're looking for aligned philanthropic partners who are willing to invest in our communities to be able to meet these emergency needs. And I mean, quite frankly, it's an ongoing emergency in most of our communities. I mean, this has exacerbated conditions, but we don't need to stop serving meals once the retail stores open up again. I mean, people are hungry in the city every single day. So we want to build up the infrastructure so that we can continue meeting our community's needs in the long term, and that we can do that ourselves. There's enough. The BIPOC organizations in Chicago are powerful, but often get under-resourced relative. And we see this in all the research and statistics that come out, but you feel it here too, that, in any given day, you see a grant award to white-led organizations that are like, with pictures of people of color on their screen saying we're helping people while our organizations get passed up. And I think that's, you know, we're coming together to try to change that dynamic in the city, and you know, as a collaboration, we can elevate and in cooperation with each other, we can elevate our voices more to push towards that kind of change.
Great, thanks. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you about how do we translate this current moment into a new vision for a lot of our audience, you know, nonprofit sector. How do they think of themselves? You know, there's been a tendency for, one of the members on our committee talks about begging on two knees or something like that, right? Not being active political actors, you know, sort of just being political takers. How can we change that?
Well, thank you. Besides the social accounting things that I spoke about, I also think that the nonprofit sector needs to get over its codependency and acknowledge our part in keeping a dysfunctional system functional, and to step back and leverage the current moment by learning integrative thinking and adopting a systems perspective, and to find our voice and become active in policy making. So instead of focusing example solely on our own organizations, where we think, oh, I'm an arts and culture and I'm environment, and how does that feed into the larger system, right? We haven't been good at that. So we need to start seeing ourselves more as an interconnected whole. And then we need to be able to recognize underlying patterns, feedback loops, and how a system's structural composition generates behaviors which then amplify or enhance outcomes that we may or may not want. We've lost that ability to see how these pieces interconnect. And also who's at the table and how that makes a difference. And so how can we expand inclusivity? And I see a capabilities platform as a platform for policy making. So that's work by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which really speaks to what Camille and Will were talking about. Like, how can we develop the skills and capacities of people at the grassroots level to become self-sufficiency, which will then create a spiraling up economy versus this mythical trickle down, which we clearly know is not working. And so the capabilities platform will help us develop these cooperative skills that creates a safety net across multiple levels. And also to move from a cost benefit analysis and deficit-based focus to an aspirational and asset design focus. And lastly, I do want to hit on humanistic management as a intervention, because so often our organizations reflect toxic patterns of relationships, which, you know, mirror maybe our own family dysfunctions. And so humanistic management offers us to step back and recognize the dignity of people as inherently worthy, and also caring for them, not just as an instrumental tool to create profit, but that, you know, they're here because they need well-being and cooperation too. So those are my suggestions.
Great, thanks. And Camille, I want to go to you. So I've got a ton of questions from the audience. I'm going to try to get to a few of them at least. And one of the questioners was like, was wondering if, first of all, if you have written up sort of your tips for what are the skills we need for system change. But could you talk about them in any case?
Yeah, no, I haven't been doing. I used to do a lot more field building, or like that. I've been cutting onions and instead in the kitchen, but yeah, the things I talked about, I feel like we focus on different aspects of what it takes to change a system, and you know, some of that is movement building. I think a critical piece of that is, you know, getting our people together and organized. But in order to do that, often, you know, there's so much out there. It takes a lot to get into our minds and that we need to change the narrative about how critical this is in order to build those movements. So I think narrative change is a critical piece of what we need to do. And I feel like part of the narrative change is I hear a lot, yeah, but there's no real other option. Like, the other option in people's heads is an autocratic communist, like, you know, system. It's like, well, I don't want that. And this is the other one, and this one looks better to me. And so opening their imagination with different models and saying, hey, what about economic democracy? What if the capital, that the excess capital was community controlled? What if our workplaces were democratically governed? What if we weren't controlled by one large entity that is the state? What if we were autonomous in our own communities and community was defined in a lot of different ways? You know, like those, but it's hard to, theoretically, it's like read these articles by these academics. We need to show people what those different things are and have them come to life and say, like, look, here is a business that is owned by, you know, formerly incarcerated Black women, or this is a business that's owned by its workers, and it works just as well. And it does, you know, and maybe we can't say it works just as well in capitalism because we can't raise the same amount of capital right now, and there are going to be systemic barriers that stop us, but we can say it could work. Like if you open up your imagination, if we allocated our resources differently, if we change the rules, this could work. And I think we need to be able to, that those new models are what do that. But I think in order to be successful, these are all things that build on each other. In order to be successful in these new models, we need to learn how to cooperate with each other. We need to learn how to respect each other, how to come into work and not yell at each other, and respect each other's skills, respect that we all have something to offer, and some of these skills are not more valuable than others. All of us as humans are just as valuable. Those aren't skills that we've learned. That respect, those aren't skills that we've learned. So I feel like all of those elements need to feed into each other, and we're all doing our little part of chipping at this and towards the common vision that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I would just echo that. Like, we have to move beyond theory. So much historically in this country, and really not just even in this country, but historically, we as people feel comfortable with something once we've been able to try it or demonstrate it. And if we remain in theory, it's far more difficult to move people to try and experiment and do, or to practice new models of being and doing. So yeah, I completely agree.
Great, thanks. Elizabeth, there's a question for you about if you could provide an example of a case study, sort of mini case study of social accounting and how that's actually benefited.
Yeah, I would point everybody to the community capitals framework, and I provided the articles and the resources that'll be sent out to everybody, but it was used for rural economic development in Nebraska. And it showed how investments at the grassroots level through knowledge and community learning groups shifted the thinking and interactions to develop this spiraling up economy where by getting people together, building social capital and their intellectual capital, they created then collective power, which attracted economic resources and new jobs to the community, and really shifted the dynamics in the ways that Camille was talking about and Will just a moment ago. So the community capitals model will give you many case studies, especially in terms of rural economic development.
Great, thanks. So I think this is a question for Camille. There was somebody asking about conversion to worker ownership. You know a little bit of that. You know, and you know, how much of a difference does that actually make? You know, so you have the conversion, but is the business different afterwards? You know, are the values different?
Yeah, so we're talking about here often in a succession planning context, what would it look like? And there's a lot of people working hard on this as a possible response to COVID as well, helping businesses become worker-owned from a traditional business structure. And there's a lot of successful examples of businesses transitioning to worker ownership. It's like a process where the owner steps back, usually over time, and then has workers fill the capacity that they were providing. And I think that it's kind of a difficult time to think of you know, just before COVID, we were ramping up like, okay, baby boomers, you know, retiring owners, we're going to transition a bunch of businesses to worker ownership. And now it's like, do you want to be selling businesses where you don't have any understanding of what the future is going to look like for this business? to workers and having them take on the risk right now. So like, for instance, one of the things that we're doing instead is there's a closing catering business in Chicago right now, and we went and bought a lot of their equipment, and we're like, it's not a conversion of that business to worker ownership, but a lot of the assets they built over time are now co-owned by worker owners. So folks in the worker cooperative field are looking at how this conversion idea of taking existing, profitable, or at least pre-COVID profitable businesses and transitioning them to worker ownership can be a way to preserve Main Street during this time.
Great, thanks. So there are a lot of questions about organizing and building powers, you might imagine. I'm going to read much of this one because I just thought we have 38 million people who have lost their jobs in 9 weeks, right? It's almost an astonishing. It is an astonishing number. It's unbelievable. And so, and of course, this is hitting people of color the most. So how do you go about strengthening and empowering these people as a community to move forward and for the benefit of all, in the fabric of interrelationships?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that is the existential question ahead of all of us. Like, it's a great question and a difficult one. In so many organizing spaces where we have a big long-term goal, we also know the importance of small, immediate wins. And I believe that we're in a similar place right now where we need kind of immediate change. We need to see immediate wins in order to encourage folks for some of the larger fights we want to have. One example has been around restorative justice and criminal justice reform since COVID-19. Immediately we saw a push to get people out, people who are being held in jails and detention centers on pretrial detention or being held in ICE detention centers. There was an active push to get people out. And in many places, they were quite successful in getting folks freed for the sake of stopping the spread of the virus and protecting the most vulnerable. And so some of that has been very critical and important to reinvigorating the broader movement for justice reform in this country, and frankly, to modeling new ways to practice restorative justice that does not rely so heavily on the carceral system. So I share that to say that, like, we need opportunities like that where we can push and model for something else. Similarly, the push for hazard pay and heroes pay is extending the conversation around what does a real living wage look like. The push for stimulus funding that comes on a regular basis, or government funding that comes on a regular basis, pushes the conversation around universal basic income. So where are the opportunities to dig in and encourage us so that we keep fighting for broader economic justice?
Great, thanks. So a lot of people have expressed an interest in us addressing, what is the role of nonprofit and philanthropy in advancing system change, and any on-the-ground examples of addressing in a significant way systemic inequality that you want to lift up?
I mean, I think all of this is working to address the systemic inequalities that we see in our communities. In terms of the role of nonprofits and philanthropy, right now, philanthropic capital is what makes a lot of this social work happen. Even, what we did with Shy Fresh Kitchen, my consulting firm funded it, but behind all the work that I'm doing for my consulting firm was nonprofit or union funding, right? Like, it was either nonprofits or unions that were funding in philanthropic capital that at the end of the day led to this business being in existence when I look at the sources of capital. So I think the role of the philanthropic sector is to identify those strategies. If you are aligned with the systemic change that we're looking to create, that we're mentioning on this webinar, look for those strategies that are building power, changing the narrative, that are building up models for economic democracy, and that are, you know, and I think it's not just worker cooperatives that we're talking about here. Land trusts are really, and real estate cooperatives are a really critical part, us owning our own land and owning our own housing. I mean, anything where communities democratically own their own organizations, those are the types of initiatives that I think we should be investing in, and especially ones that are led by, controlled by the board, the executive directors, all the people who are reflected in the organizations are the same ones who are from those communities and are, you know, I think lifting up leaders of color who are working to make changes in their own communities, and especially those that have an element of long-term power building or democracy, you know, identify those experiments and invest in them. Great,
thanks. Just kind of a similar question, so I'm going to throw this at you, Will, anyway. So, so there's a question about, you know, if I'm a small or mid-scale nonprofit, how do I make this actionable? And it occurred to me that probably a lot of the Black worker centers that you're talking about are not huge organizations, but, you know, how do you, if you're interested in promoting more aligned community development that boosts wealth in communities of color, you know, how does a small or mid-sized organization do that effectively?
Well, I'll jump in, and the other resource I would encourage people to take a look at is the Indiana CPA Society 2020 Integrated Report. It's really a model for how organizations can start embracing integrated thinking to say who are their stakeholders and who needs to be at the table and have a voice in the governance and decision making. Why are we here? What are the values that we're trying to enact? How do we do that? And how does that align with our strategy? And what are the resources we need to develop and allocate? And their integrated report can serve as a model. And I feel like everybody in the nonprofit sector, and actually all organizations, can use this as a template to start talking about their values and developing this more systemic thinking. The other thing I point to is—
Elizabeth, can I go to Will? I'm sorry. Okay.
Well, yeah, no, I'll check that as well. And all I'll add on that particular question is, specifically as relates to Black workers, there's a constellation of 8 Black worker centers around the country. They have a national umbrella as well. In the handouts after this presentation, their information will be listed. There is also a host of other worker centers around the country that have filled a gap left by unions over past decades of worker organizing. And those worker centers often work with communities of color and low-income communities of color, wage workers around the country. So I would encourage you to research and find some that might be near you. But in regards to the previous question around philanthropy, I did want to interject in terms of how philanthropy can respond. I don't know how common knowledge it is that most endowed foundations are only by law required to give up to 5% away every year of their profits and grants. And that has been a practice that has been commonly held for decades, and it's also been a practice that has been challenged for decades. We are in a moment now where philanthropy can do something very differently. And if philanthropy may not or is not willing to give up the whole house, they can certainly move beyond the 5%. There are efforts around the country, there are conversations around the country right now to move philanthropy to 10%. Give away 10% of your corpus or your profits every year in grant making to fund the communities that you support. And so much of this is about hoarding resources and capital for the longevity of the work. And in many ways, we understand that, but we also understand that this is the crisis moment that we did not think was coming. This is that crisis moment. And so there is no rainy day to save for if you're not doing something right now. So I would encourage philanthropy to respond by giving more, and flexibility and grant applications and reports is all good and well, but move the dollars.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And that's definitely been a big focus of MPQ in this crisis. I did want to just ask you really briefly, like, what is like the budget of a Black Worker Center, so people get a sense of scale? Because I think sometimes you see it on a screen, you think, oh, this is really huge, and I don't think they necessarily are.
No, not at all. They're small. They're small, and depending on the city, gosh, they can vary anywhere from a $50,000 budget to a $500,000 annual budget. There have been some groups that I have made grants to in the past where, there's a practice in philanthropy called tipping, where you have to make sure your grant doesn't equal more than 25% of the budget. And so figuring out what that looks like so that we can fund this small Black Worker Center to do the work that they need to do, and to help them leverage our funding to get more institutional funding. But that is something that's such a delicate balance for many Black Worker Centers because they're so heavily underfunded. Most of them, I would say, are $1 million or less per year in funding.
Great, thanks. We had a question, several people were interested, not surprisingly, in, there's so many crises. So there's the crisis of the pandemic. There's also the climate emergency, right? And it doesn't seem like we have a lot of time. So, so the question is really, how do you pursue a transformative vision across the board and avoid sort of the pressure to return to so-called normal or normalcy?
So absolutely, climate change. I mean, have you all seen the memes out there where it's like, hey, let's flatten this curve too, like climate change. And I think that our movements need to be, and I think, somebody mentioned in the questions, New Economy Coalition and other groups that hold all of these principles together into one vision, right? That we need to be centered on life, on humanity and the earth, and that our policies need to move quickly to make those kinds of shifts. I think just like COVID is highlighting what is, the structural flaws in our economic system, we are seeing increasing evidence of what our activities are doing to the planet, and the narrative is changing rather quickly on, but perhaps too late, on what our current activities are going to do to the environment. I think it's a matter of making it very urgent right now that our policies Green New Deal or other policies that to reinvigorate our economic system need to also be in line with our need to shift our practices to flatten that ecological curve as well.
Great. So we're getting close to the hour. I wanted to at least, there's a couple questions about immigrants, and of course they've been, immigrants have been scapegoated in this crisis. There's also been a number of folks who are in detention facilities that are petri dishes for COVID. How do we build a vision that's inclusive of all people who are in the United States?
Yeah, solidarity, I think, is critical right now, and I think that one of the opportunities of having anti-Asian sentiment right now, so much widespread anti-Asian sentiment in our time right now, is realizing how we realigning other people of color as all in solidarity, right? Because I feel like, you know, sometimes it's easy to be like, oh, over there, you know, and there is prejudice within our communities against other communities, and it goes both ways, and we all experience it mostly because we're so segregated from each other. But these are the moments where it's like, oh, you know, I felt like there was a rise in solidarity in the Black community for the Latinx community when when we saw all the children in those horrible conditions, and saying like, oh yeah, they treat you that like this too, right? Like, and I think that with the Asian community, seeing the discrimination, that we are all in a boat of being other, and having people and taking this moment to say, okay, we need to continue to grow to be in solidarity with each other. And I think that you know, like the worker cooperatives that we're building here in Chicago, one of them is a refugee-led worker cooperative, Blue Tin Cooperative. Others are Latinx cooperatives. Others are Black cooperatives, and we're all coming together to think about real estate strategies together, to think about food system strategies together, because we, you know, see that we can't make the kind of systemic change that we're looking for in the silos of our own communities. We need to come together.
Great. So we're almost at the hour. I'll ask, like, just for closing thoughts. You know, I think about Gar Alperovitz, who's of course part of our group, and you know, he has this piece that's called "If you don't like state socialism, you don't like capitalism, what do you like?" You know, how should we think about this current moment, and what are we learning? So just quick thoughts, maybe 30 seconds each, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll start by saying I think what we're learning about is who we are and who we want to be. So in its root, this is a humanistic and a humanities-based, finding our humanity or denying our humanity. And I would encourage people to model the behavior that they want to see. So looking at Mondragon Workers Cooperative, for example, that has a wage gap cap. And so workers can't be paid less than 10, the highest one can't be paid more than 10 times. So modeling the behavior, I think, is an important step.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add to that nothing works without people. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest lessons right now. Consumerism, consumption, services, all of those things that were held in such high value in particular ways, none of it works without people. So valuing humanity for sure.
Camille.
I mean, I'm just excited to have, just in terms of closing thoughts, I'm so excited to have this opportunity with such great folks to highlight the strategies of a new change in the system. And so I just want to shout out to you, Steve, and to the nonprofit quarterly crew for bringing us all together and giving this opportunity to highlight new models.
Great. Well, thank you to Will Quarry, Camille Kerr, Elizabeth Castillo, and for all of you who were on this webinar with your excellent questions. I know we didn't get to them all, but we tried to get to as many as we could. Please do complete the evaluation, and thank you for your interest in this work, and we will be continuing.